If you have questions, please put them in the chat. However, I have a hard time walking and chewing gum at the same time, so I won't get to them until the very end of the presentation. If it's something super urgent, then please notify Laura or Adrian, and they can unmute and bring that to my attention. So here we go. It's a small outline what we're gonna do. Why garden with native plants? I know I'm speaking to converts here and preaching to the choir, but we'll really quickly touch upon that. Finding right plants for the right spot, Chicagoland's native plant community, some tools that I use to pick plants, and a few things to remember. So why garden with native plants, right? I mean, not everyone knows them. Yeah, people often have questions. Well, first of all, they're beautiful. If you have any doubts, let me show you a few pictures. You have wild hyacinth here. If you live in the Oak Park River Forest area, there are a few forest preserves that have just fields of this, and it looks quite magical when it's growing. Beautiful ferns, or butterfly weed, which is the supermodel of all the milkweeds with bright orange that you can plant in your garden. Native plants create habitat. Not only do they create a home for some insects, like for example, the hollow stems can become home for some bees, but they are food a lot of times for our insects that have evolved here along with the plants. So people know about the monarch butterfly and the milkweed connection, where the milkweed plants are the host plant for the monarch butterfly, and the caterpillar pictured here on prairie milkweed will only eat milkweed plants. But all the Lepidoptera, meaning moths and butterflies, have a special type of relationship with some sort of plant or group of plants. And same with some bees. Some bees will only collect pollen from a specific genre or a family. So by having those plants in your garden, you're helping to sustain our local pollinators. So, it's not just butterflies and bees and beetles. It's also cute frogs. This is one on Baptiste or false indigo. And this is one of those bees that is can only collect pollen from wild geraniums. So if there's no wild geraniums, that bee species will no longer be there. Prairies store a lot of carbon, and that might sound a little counterintuitive, right? We hear about planting trees and how trees store carbon, and that's true. Trees store a lot of carbon, but also they die after a while, and that carbon gets back into the atmosphere. Prairies are also known as upside down rainforest because most of their weight is actually underground, and the carbon that they put in creating those roots stays in the soils for a really long time. Hence, where the prairies were is where our corn belt is, some of our most fertile soil in the world. They also help with stormwater storage. So now, furthest to the left, you can see our lawn. That lawn has really, really tiny, short roots, and those roots will grow, and they don't break up the soil very much. So when the water comes down in heavy rains, only about 30% of the water gets absorbed by your lawn, and everything else just rushes off into the sewage and eventually either into the Chicago or Des Plaines rivers or into my basement. So if you plant a lot of native plants that have deeper roots, they make these tiny little corridors in the soil, and that's where the water gathers. So that's one of the ways in which stormwater is, stored on site with native plants. And they also help with erosion control, again, thanks to those deep roots. And mental health. I think we sort of realized more with times of COVID that nature really helps with mental health. And there's more and more studies that show that being in nature for 20 to 30 minutes helps kids concentrate more. And you can see my daughter's looking at a monarch butterfly and trying to capture, I think that's a male, trying to capture him. And everyone can enjoy a garden from age 1 till 101. So when you're trying to put plants into your garden, I want you to sort of flip your thinking. A lot of times when you go to a big box store and you buy plants for a given garden, they will have, say, the hydrangeas, and then next to the hydrangeas, you will have all the different ways in which you can amend the soil so the hydrangeas will thrive in your garden. We're asking you to do it the other way around with native plants. Don't change the habitat around them to accommodate the plants because it's going to be a pain. Look at the habitat that you have around and in your yard or wherever you're developing that native plant garden, and then find the plant that matches those conditions. So just sort of reverse the way people traditionally go about it. So observe your conditions. See, is your area sunny or shady? And that can be because you have a tree there, but in an urban setting, it might be because, you know, you're between two other houses and at 3 o'clock, the shadows are fairly long and your plants are suddenly finding themselves in shade. Figure out if you have areas that are moist or dry. Maybe you have an area that just always is a little mucky, and that might be because there's a gutter that's and with a spout that leaves the water out, or maybe an area that's really, really dry. You can find something that grows in either one of those conditions, and then consider your soil type. Sometimes, you know, you have clay and people are, well, nothing wants to grow in clay, or maybe you have sandy areas. So knowing these 3 things will help you determine what plants do well in it. And look at the community makeup and functional groups of plants that you have. So this is a plant community right here. We have a probably mesic or wet mesic prairie. And if you go and take a walk around forest preserves or other natural areas, you can look at that plant community and pay attention to what you see. So what we see here, there are no trees. There are a lot of flowers, but there are also grasses. I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? There's a lot of grasses and grass-like plants here. And when we are creating a prairie garden, you're not going to do a prairie restoration in front of your house unless you live on a few acres. And then I'm highly envious. But you can look to Mother Nature to provide you with the how-tos, and that's one of them. Okay. So what are these plant communities, right? That's what we're here for. We want to learn what the plant communities are. I was supposed to ask a question. Forget that. What are the 3 things? I just mentioned them. People can put that in the chat. I'll actually look at a chat now. What are the 3 things that you think determine a plant community, or what plant community will grow in a given spot? You can put it in the chat. Don't be shy. I gave it away. We just talked about them. Yes, moisture, light, and soil. Thank you, Jan. Sun, shade, water. Exactly. Thank you. Okay. So moisture, light, and soil. Those are the 3 things that will determine what plants grow there in your spot. So when we look at the moisture gradient in a natural area, we have on your right on the page, you have open water. Those are our marshes, rivers, lakes, semi-marshes. And then you have a gradient going to dryness. We have a marsh that can have some emergent vegetation. That is the vegetation that, well, I'm not sure, Galaxy S20 is drying. Marshes can have emergent vegetation, so that's vegetation that is rooted and emerges out of water. Submerged vegetation, things that grow underwater, and floating, things that grow and float on water, just like as the name says. And then as you go up in dryness, you will go to sedge meadow. We'll go through pictures and talk about those more. And then wet prairie, which is actually a type of a wetland legally. To be a legal wetland, you have to have hydrology, So moisture during growing season, you have to have hydric soils and you have to have hydric vegetation. And then you have mesic prairie, mesic meaning medium. And depending if you're a lumper or a splitter, I'm more of a lumper than a splitter. Then people will put wet mesic, and dry mesic. And then we have dry prairie and xeric prairie. Oh, I'm not sure how to get those drawings off. Can someone help with that? Let's see. Maybe one of the people leading can see how we can get the annotations off.
Oh, God.
I think some accidentally. So here is another example of some of those prairie communities: wet prairie, which is legally a wetland, wet mesic prairie, dry mesic, and dry. And as you can see, the drier you go, sort of the plant community, the plants are not as densely packed. You can see some soil exposed. So those are some of the things we'll talk about more. Don't worry. Okay. So we covered moisture. And I'll go back also. Moisture, a lot of times that is also correlated with your elevation. And because we are so flat here, sometimes a matter of 2 to 4 or 6 inches can be a different plant community because your moisture levels have changed so dramatically. So you might also have that in your yard where, you know, you have an area or like a little hill leading to your house, and it will be drier on top there, and that's fine. So the same gradient happens when we think about sun levels. So the amount of sun that hits the ground, that's what sun levels are. Prairies are 90 to 100% of the land gets full sun. And that's because there's no trees. Historically, there could have been thickets, meaning like different types of shrubs put together here and there. And that's because of fire. We are in a fire adapted ecosystem, and the fire was natural as well as anthropogenic. The indigenous communities, especially the Potawatomi, they're called the people of their specialty was fire. They burned those areas, and they did it so there wouldn't be woody encroachment, but also so the bison would come, etc. As you're beginning to get more trees showing up, you're entering into a savanna. And again, depending on your preferences, some people are splitters, some are lumpers, some people will say open savanna or oak barrens. Thank you for that screen. Open savanna, or sometimes called oak barrens, that is a really transitional community and between prairie and savanna. And then people will call savanna and closed savanna. And then when you have about 90% of light block, that's when you start having a woodland. And we have very few forests in this area. So this is a pretty cool chart. I didn't make that. I borrowed it from the Chicago Wilderness Urban Tree Assessment that shows different types of species if you combine both the prairie, like the sun levels, so prairie, savanna, woodland, and forest, with the moisture levels, dry mesic, and what trees would grow in some of those areas. So a lot of times, certain communities, we will call it a sandy, dry prairie, sand-dry prairie. So that's when we are adding the last component, which is our substrate, the soil type. And different substrates, if anyone has taken this at school at some point, you can take a lump of soil in your hand and perform a soil test and figure out if you have a clay, silt, or loamy type of soil in your garden. There are YouTube videos that can walk you through it. It's a little difficult. There's also jar tests that you can do, that you can look up, soil jar tests on YouTube, and they'll help you really easily determine what type of soil you have in your garden. But a lot of times we know, right? And a lot of the soil we have like silty loam, or I have a lot of silty clay where I'm at. And that's okay. There are plants that will thrive in that habitat. So let's go through these plant communities, look at some cool pictures, and then talk about the plants that we find there. So what you're looking at here is a hemi-marsh. A hemi-marsh is a type of a habitat that had about 50% open water and 50% vegetated water. If you are familiar with the Calumet region, a lot of hemi-marshes were in the the sand and dune swales. In between the dunes, there would be swales with water. A lot of those were hemi-marshes. Some hemi-marshes would be back lakes to rivers or other lakes. And their characteristic was that the water was oscillating. So sometime on a wet year, it would be filled with water, and sometime on a dry year, the water would be drained. Muskrats would be really happy. And so it was a very dynamic ecosystem that sort of thrived on some stability, but also some disturbance. We're not going to concentrate a lot about that, because if your property has a hemi-marsh proper, you can probably afford to hire a nice contractor to help you with a large restoration. No, but they're really beautiful habitats. The next one up is the marshes. So marshes are habitats that will have standing water most of the year. They might get a little drier come, July and August, but there will be water in the water table right underneath the surface. They have a lot of emergent vegetation, so different rushes, plants in the genus Juncus. They will have a lot of sedges, carex, and some grasses. So people call sedges, rushes, and grasses graminoids. They're still flowering plants because their seed heads are flowers. And there will be some other what we would collectively call flowers in there. The picture here has beautiful blue flag irises. They're some of my most favorite plants. I unfortunately don't have the habitat at home to plant those, but they're just gorgeous. You can have water parsnip growing there and some other things. So these are just few things that you might have growing in a marsh. You might have blue flag iris, soft rush, Juncus effusius, spike rushes, Eolacris. Those are the small, really dark green rushes that are cool. Duck potatoes, water parsnips, pickerel weed, which is that sort of deep purple, beautiful plant. And we should think about structure. So some of the shrubs that will do well in those wet conditions would be button bushes and willows. Willows are really beneficial if you can have a willow in your garden, because it's one of the first things that creates pollen in spring, and that is a very important food source for a lot of the emerging bees. So that's a hold on. Oh, I think I went back. Apologies. So as we're moving up the gradient into areas a little drier, we have sedge meadows. So remember, we just talked about sedges. They look like grasses, not technically grasses. You might have heard sedges have edges, and that's due to their like triangular formation of leaves and stems. And a lot of the sedge meadows, it's actually stayed in peril ecosystem. There's not a lot of it left, but a lot of different plants in the genus Carex. Carex stricta, lacustris, so lake sedge, tussock sedge are some of the things that, and we have green sedge here up front that will like it. Some of the things like woolgrass too. Although woolgrass sedge, I know it's complicated, common names. So some of the things, again, Carex stricta, Carex pallida, blue joint grass is an attractive grass that I can do well in a garden. It looks a little bit like reed canary grass, but it's not, don't worry. but it can be a little aggressive. So I'm not in nature. I'm not sure how it does in the garden setting, but in nature, blue joint grass can put its elbows out a little bit. Swamp candles, water hemlock. I absolutely love water hemlock, Sium suave. It's a beautiful plant. And also blue monkey flower. And you might have cattails. And depending on how big your garden is, perhaps you want to get rid of them. And especially if they're establishing in your garden, they're probably the non-native hybrid cattail. And if someone is wondering, how do you get rid of cattails? In a garden setting, it's probably easy to pull them out. You can also cut them below water level. And when the water, if you have water pooling in that area, the water will kill it, or you can very judiciously apply herbicide just to the plant itself. Wet prairie is our next point. So I love wet prairie because they remind you of a prairie. They have a water table pretty close to their surface, but it has a lot of forbs already. So as sedge meadow before wouldn't have many what we call collectively flowers, forbs. There's few like water hemlock or blue monkey flower. Wet prairie is where your swamp milkweeds are thriving, your lobelia, so cardinal flower and blue lobelia, and it has a lot of different beautiful ways. I love the picture that I there just because it shows that removing woody vegetation really works. That's why it has that woody vegetation up stumps up front. And that's something you might have to do. You might have to look around and be like, what are the shrubs or trees in my yard? Maybe they're buckthorn and you want to remove them. And then take the next step in healing the land. So some of the plants that do well in wet prairie are rose and prairie milkweeds. So milkweeds, again, helping the monarch butterfly. Water hemlock, and water hemlock is in the carrot family or parsley family, so it will help the swallowtails. Blue monkey flower, Virginia rye is a grass that does very well. Some of the carex sedges are stricta, Baumbaxii, vulpinoidea, which is the brown fox sedge, and pallida. I would recommend Carex vulpinoidea. It's a nice one. It's one of the taller sedges, maybe. It grows about over your knee high, but it's a very enduring sedge. It can take some spells of dry. It can be submerged by water. And it's not very picky, so I like that one. A very showy grass that you might put in your garden is cordgrass. And if you're looking at this and thinking, gee, Iza, this looks like things I could put in my rain garden, I want to say yes. If you're creating a rain garden, wet prairie is the habitat you want to model, because it can take some drought, as it does in prairie in July and August, where it's unbelievably hot, but it can take standing water as well. Some other great things: false beer tongue or penstanum, obedient plant Phytostasia, sweet black-eyed Susans, marsh blazing stars, Riddell's goldenrod, that is my favorite goldenrod, and turtlehead, the plant that we had in the beginning, right? Don't change the conditions to have this plant in your garden. Pick the right plant for your garden. So if you have an area that is moist, turtlehead will love it. It can even take some shade. And that is also a house plant, I believe, for the Baltimore checker spot, but I might have that one wrong. Going up the gradient, we're moving to mesic prairies. And mesic prairies, mesic meaning like medium moisture. It will look differently every week of the growing season. So here we have a picture of the mesic prairie in spring. How do I know it's spring? Well, the grasses aren't really tall. Mesic prairie is where your big blue stems, Indian grasses, switch grasses are really thriving. And so no tall grasses is one reason that I know this is spring. those grasses that I just mentioned are grasses that start really picking up in growth in your second half of the summer when it's hot. They have a different photosynthesis mechanism, a C4 photosynthesis mechanism, and those hot and sort of dry conditions really give them an upper hand. But what we have going here is some Canada wild rye. It's a nice grass. I really like it. It will thrive in your garden, come in even from seed, but then as your forbs begin to get bigger and more robust, Canada wild rye will not be a bully. It'll actually just sort of disappear into the background. We would have prairie brome beginning to grow there. Spiderwort were the blue dots that you saw. Prairie duck are those big leaves. Those are beautiful. They make really great winter or dry plant arrangements. I recommend that. Black Susans, and I think it's flowering spurge. That's a little off season that's blooming there. But this is also Mesic Prairie. This is Mesic Prairie in July. This is Wolf Road Prairie, one of the most magical places in Cook County, I think. I'm partial to Wolf Road Prairie. I really love it. So look at the structure of those plants there, right? We want to imitate what Mother Nature is doing. So we have some tall plants and plants that have stopped blooming already and plants that are blooming, and you have grasses, and they sort of grow in clumps, all intertangled really beautifully. And those really tall plants, those are the big leaves that we saw before. All those were two different prairies. Prairie duck, just like other silphiums, it's a prairie skyscraper, shoots up a really tall stem. They can get up to 8 feet with a beautiful sunflower-like flower at the end. Birds absolutely go gaga over that seed. So if you want to attract birds to your yard and you have a spot that is sunny, I also recommend that. So what we see here? We see prairie duck, those tall yellow sunflower-like plants. We see blazing stars, or those are the pink purple feather-like plants. Rattlesnake master up front. I'm gonna try to see. Wild bergamot that was already past bloom. Some asters that I know are there, but it's not their season yet. Asters bloom in the fall. So you have sky blue, smooth, and New England asters. You have the Illinois showy and thick trefoil, Indian grass, low blue stem, big blue stem switchgrass. So I'll go back to this because I'll make a point I'll try to hammer on a little later too. We have a whole bunch of diversity, as you can see here. And it's not just diversity in different types of plants. We have diversity in approaches, in functions that those plants play. So for example, prairie duck, this tall plant, has a tap root. So a root that is, pretty thick with age, but goes straight down to get the water. But some of the other plants, like in the back, you have big blue stem, they have more fibrous roots. So they complement each other because they have different mechanisms to source they need, in this case, being nutrients. You have things like right back here, it's wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa. It's a very versatile plant, could do well in full sun to part shade, but that one is past bloom right now, but other things are blooming. You have the early goldenrods beginning to come in, yellow coneflowers. So then I think I said that there's going to be asters and there's going to be some legumes. Legumes are nitrogen fixers, so they put nutrients into the soil, and they're a really important part of our garden. So when you're planting your garden, try to think of the diversity, because not only are you helping the plants get along better, but you're also helping a larger range of different animals, insects, and pollinators. Sorry, I love this picture so much. I could probably talk about it for another 25 minutes. So I'm just gonna move on so everyone doesn't go crazy with me there. And this is just another prairie in July, and you can see some of the grasses here. And within that prairie, just by the vegetation, you know, the hydrology is changing. So right up front here, we have cordgrass. So that likes it more moist. So we know that's probably wet prairie here. And then, but in the back, it's probably drier because there's big blue stem in the back and Indian grass. But you don't really see an elevation change. And there was another picture of prairies in summer, which is the best view to have, but also to show that the hydrology can change based on soil or your elevation fairly rapidly. So next time when you're walking through forest preserves and just looking around, try to see if you can sort of delineating the different moisture levels or the different topography, because sometimes you can literally see the plant community changing, especially like in fall, if you have goldenrods or asters, they begin or they end suddenly. And then you know that's where your hydrology has changed. And our last prairie is the dry prairie. And a lot of us, I think we have a dry prairie like plant community, while we really have more of a mesic. But if you have sandy soils, then definitely you have a good potential for a dry prairie. And those plants, you can have big bluestem in here, but in a dry prairie, it will never be 6 feet tall. It'll be shorter. And a lot of the plants are not as dense and luscious. And sometimes you even have spots where you can see the soil. But what we see growing here are purple and white. I can't spell. Should be purple and white prairie clovers. Those are the purples here. That's one of my, I can't say one of my favorite plants. There are too many, but they are just so beautiful. And I know they're available at the native plant sale. And if you have a sunny spot that's on the drier end, everyone should have that plant. I love incorporating that plant with spirabolus, with drop seed by entrances or walkways, because it just has that poppy look into it. There's prairie and sand coreopsis, and those are the yellows. I know this prairie has butterfly weed and short green milkweed. Side oats gamma is a really wonderful grass that will do well in your garden in mesic as well as dry conditions. Low blue stem. There's lead plant here, and that is a small shrub that's in our prairies. Also a great plant. Pale purple coneflower. And those are these right here. Gray goldenrod later in this in the fall. And then some of our and heath aster also a fall one. Then some of the spring dry prairie species would be prairie smoke, prairie phlox, and prairie violet. So our savannas. Savannas are habitats that will have some shade because there are trees. Now, again, in your home setting, think of the buildings that are providing shade. Savannas are known for dappled light because a lot of our savannas here regionally are with oaks, full of oaks. So what you see here is a black oak savanna in Pembroke Township. If you haven't been, I really recommend. Those are beautiful. And you can see there's a lot of vegetation here, right? This is fall. The leaves have fallen, but you can see that there's a lot of grasses and other vegetation here. And that is because savanna is this sort of transitional ecosystem between prairie and a woodland. Woodland doesn't have a lot of tall grasses, but a savanna does. And savannas can be open or closed savannas depending on the amount of light. And they will also change with time, right? They're dynamic ecosystems. If you don't have a fire going in for a few years, that savanna will close up because you'll have new things sprouting. But if you do have fire going in, it'll be more of an open savanna. Now, I know what you're thinking, oh, we shouldn't have fire so things don't die, but actually having a lot of light levels allows for oak regeneration. So you want to have those, so you do want to put fire through there. But has nothing to do with gardens, so I will stop. Another thing that I want to bring up is that as you have, look at the structure of this. You have tall trees, and then there are shrubs around here, and then we have grasses and forbs. So if you have tall trees in your house or around your garden, don't be shy to put few, because you already have dappled sunlight and part shade or part sun conditions. Don't be shy to use some shrubs. Shrubs are really great. Few reasons. A lot of the shrubs bloom early in this season, so they're really wonderful sources of pollen and nectar for a lot of our pollinators that are waking up. But they have a lot of structural positive parts, especially for birds, a lot of berries, and they're just absolutely beautiful. So I would encourage you to look into shrubs. And I believe there was a lecture on just shrubs through the West Cook Wild ones some time ago. So maybe it's in your video library. And this is another savanna that you can look here. And I brought this picture in because you can see how savannas differ and how they're literally, the picture shows where the sun hits and then where the shade is. Oh, savanna is that transitional system. So things that you will have growing there, there'll be grasses and sedges that are really important because, again, I said savannas are fire reliant, and things that carry fire very well are grasses and sedges, especially grasses because they're hollow on the inside. And that means that when they burn, they have that oxygen inside of the stem carrying the fire further. So some of the rice, wild rice, Elmis species that will grow in the savanna are silky wild rye and Virginia rye. Virginia will grow where it's wetter, and silky where it's drier, because you will have savannas that are on the wetter end and some that are on the drier end. Some of our browns and also sedges such as Carica sylvanica, so that's the oak sedge and the rosy sedge. If you have sandy soils, bird's foot violet, it is the species to have in a sandy savanna. But some other things that might grow there are lens leaf or sand coreopsis, purple milkweed, which is considered a true savanna species, meaning it will not be found in a woodland. It will not be found in a prairie. It's only found in savannas, because some of the plants you will see in savanna, you can also see in a woodland or in a prairie. Hairy sunflowers, rough blazing star, showy thick trefoil, rough lettuce, some goldenrods like zigzag and blue stems that can take a little bit of shade, short aster and false sunflower are some things that will grow in here. And of course, right here on the forefront of the picture is Joe pieweed, but this is the spotted Joe pieweed. The Joe pieweed, wait, hold on, wrong. Maculatum likes it more in sun, and the other ones like it more in the shade or part sun conditions. And then we finally get to woodlands. And woodlands, as you can see shown here, have a lot of empty ground. And some of it is because, you know, this is a spring picture from 2 years ago, where I think all of us probably went out into nature a lot more than we usually do. But with your woodland, with your really shady areas, this is your chance to do a true spring show. Our ephemerals or spring ephemerals are plants that do very well in woodlands and in spring. And they are just absolutely jaw-dropping and beautiful. And they are just showstoppers. So what do you see here? We see a lot of tall trees that, as the leaves will leaf out, they'll provide a lot of shade. But then you also see some intermediate layer here, some shrubs and younger trees providing that structure to the ecosystem. And then on the ground, we will have a lot of sedges So these tufts of grasses right here are sedges and some forbs. Now, a lot of our spring ephemerals will only show up for a few weeks or months in the spring, and then they will disappear with the summer. So they will do the same in your garden. So if you plant trilliums and you plant bluebell and some other ones, make sure you also plant something there that will hold the ground in the summer. So either sedges or some things that bloom later in the season. So some of the things you can have growing are trilliums, wild ginger, wild ginseng. Yes, we have native ginsengs, ferns. I mean, look at those. Those are just so beautiful. They want a photo shoot. Sedges of different sorts, phloxes, mayaples, bluebells, you name it. I know a lot of these are offered at the native plant sales, but these plants, if you guys see that you're like, oh, I'm trying to make a woodland garden, but those plants seem to be more expensive than the prairie ones. There's a good reason for it. The seed is a lot harder to collect. The seed is also a lot harder to germinate. And sometimes in order to sell us a trillium, it has to be like a second or third year plant. So those might be a little more cost prohibitive, but still invest in them. They're great plants. And if you need something to hold your soil down for erosion, just do sedges. Oak sedge, so Carex pennsylvanica, or pen sedge, some people call it, is a really beautiful plant, and it will form like grass-like mat. With time, you can acquire a few native plants for your woodland every year and add it in. And then I just wanted to show here that you see completely different native plants on these two pictures in the same woodland. And you see wild ginseng here, and trilliums and sedges. And here there's buttercups and phloxes. And that's because the picture on the left, it's more on the dry end of the woodland, and the one on the right is next to a stream. That's an ephemeral stream. So those are plants that like it a little moister. And again, no one went and planted them there. They sort of duked it out, and the plants can delineate the habitat. So when you're looking at the conditions in your garden, make sure you're picking the right plants. So at this point, you might be, thinking, okay, yeah, that's great. You mentioned all these plants, but like, how do I know if this plant is a wet loving plant and not a dry loving plant, and that it's shady and not sunny, etc.? There's many ways of doing it. One, if you buy plants from the native plant sale, either with West Cook Wild ones or other ones, they should be able to help you and have knowledgeable staff. And I know West Cook Wild ones does, because I burn a good amount of money there every spring. Another place I look through is Prairie Nursery, and many of you might have heard of it. And no, I don't get any kickbacks from them, although I should, because I always bring up their website. And it's a beautiful resource, even if you don't buy their plants. And if you go to seeds, not plants, but seeds, you can pick your sun exposure and moisture levels. And then it will provide you with a really big list of different plants that you need. So then you have a list of maybe 30 or 40 or 50, and you're thinking like, well, do I like this? Do I not like it? Is it appropriate, not appropriate? Your step number 2 is to go to IllinoisWildflowers.info, another great resource. And you can either pick under prairie wildflowers, savanna and thicket wildflowers, woodland wildflowers, or the way I do it to sort of create a shortcut for myself, I just go to Google and I'll put something like swamp milkweed and then Illinois on there, and go down, and IllinoisWildflowers.info will be one of the top 5 hits, if not the first one. So you can also do, instead of Illinois, just Illinois Wildflowers. So a lot of times I will use Prairie Moon Nursery website, sort of get an idea. Then you can go to the Illinois wildflowers. And once you click on a given plant, it'll tell you the first 2 paragraphs or so will be on how to identify the plant. You can go about halfway through descriptions of all the descriptions, and it will tell you the cultivation preferences. So we'll say, it likes it moist and shady, or whatever the conditions are. If it prefers gravelly soil, it'll mention that. And there's a cool rubric there on different insects that utilize the plant, as well as other interesting facts, or comparing the systematics of that plant to another plant, so you know how to identify them. It's a beautiful, beautiful website. Some other tools, if you're willing to drop some money, is the plant Bible for the region. So Flora of the Chicago region. It's a newish book. It's big. I have it with me and many times by my desk. It does cost a lot of money though. And if you're not using it all the time, maybe your local library can purchase that. And you can look up a plant. It'll tell you what it grows with, which is what I really like. But I'll get there. If you want to spend some money, but not necessarily $150, you can get the old edition from Woodlands of the Chicago region. Some of the Latin names will be outdated, but it does the same thing. And then the Flora, the one furthest to the left, is the original one from 100 years ago. That's just fun to read, to see what was out there. Like Lakeview had orchids all around. Did you know that? Because that blows my mind still. So, those are the books. But what I really value there is you're going through all these texts. And in here, it tells you what that plant grows with. So it's sort of like, who are the other native plants that this plant likes to hang out with? And those would be really good companions for your garden. So once you figure out that swamp milkweed is a great, and you can go here and read up, and okay, Liatris aspera intermedia might be another one, or well, if you can buy a Litrosperum, that's a Pacoon, that'll be great. But some other things, like Zizia, for example, that's a Golden Alexander's really great plant, can do half shade, and it's in the parsley family. So when I have the swallowtail caterpillars absolutely decimating my dill, I don't feel bad taking them off of my dill plant and putting them on Zizia, because that's what they'll also eat. So a few other things to remember. When we are thinking of diversity, don't think of just species numbers, although that is also important. But you don't want everything blooming in just summer. So think about bloom time diversity or phenological diversity, because that is important. So have some things blooming in the spring. And here we have some examples. Golden Alexanders can do shade and sun. Bluebells, shooting star. This is a Coreopsis. Stuff that blooms in the summer. Milkweeds, butterfly wheat, blazing star, onions, yellow coneflower. This is the wild bergamot. Things that bloom in the fall. And in the fall, the asters and goldenrods are big stars. Think about the form and function of your garden, right? If you want to, we talked about the different layers we saw in the Savanna that had forbs and grasses, but also some shrubs and thickets, and then the big trees. Try to imitate that in your garden. So maybe we have a lead plant here that is a small shrub that's in a prairie, but it's also a nitrogen fixer. I have sedges and grasses and other shrubs. This is fragrant sumac if you have dry conditions. That one is a pretty lovely plant to have. Or if you want to take it a step further, you can think of other functionality, such as wood betony. It's a hemiparasitic plant that means that its roots are gonna attach themselves to roots of other plants and sort of stunt their growth. Think about the different roles. Again, I have some shrubs here. just because I think, everyone should have few shrubs, big or tall. So few shrubs for you to consider. And then also grasses, and there's grasses and grasses for any type of conditions. So if you want your big, tall, sunny grasses, go with Indian grass, big blue stems, switchgrass. But there's also shorter ones. There's prairie brome that has these beautiful seed heads that are just, they just stop you sort of in your step. If you have a shady and or wet area, river oats is a good one. I know it can get out of control, but if the conditions aren't perfect, that plant will stay put. Or you have other plants like the northern dropseed. My mom calls it the volcano grass just because how it grows. And so it's a really beautiful addition to any space. Make sure you include some nitrogen fixers. Again, they could be the thick trefoils that we have here in purple, maybe some baptisias, the false indigos, or lupins, if you're lucky to have lupins take in your garden. They're really beautiful. It's fun to watch bees get into this keel here. They try to get in and push their way in with their front legs. Well, they push their back legs, open up the keel. It's great. If you have some more area, try wild senna. This plant, you want to attract bees. It's a pollinator magnet. It does take up some space. It can grow up to 5 to 6 feet and get a little bushy with age, but it's a really beautiful plant, and the birds love the seeds. I've seen that I think were warblers, but I'm not a bird person, so don't take my word for it, just fighting over some seed ones. And then with diversity, also think about shapes and colors, because different shapes and different colors will attract different pollinators. For example, bees don't see red. So if you're planting cardinal flower here for bees, well, they just won't see it. But different landing patterns or different ways and different depths of the flower will allow bees or butterflies of different tongue lengths to get the nectar. And then some few other things to remember is, when you're doing a native garden, allow yourself to be a little messy. This is not your living room, and your living room can also be messy. I'm not judging here. Everything doesn't need to be perfect and, done to a T. Allow for plant material to remain in your garden, especially in the spring. The picture on top is from part of my front garden last year. I never cleaned up those leaves. They just accumulate there. Maybe in a year or two, I'll try to burn it. Just don't tell my husband, okay? Because that's what Mother Nature is doing. You can see the picture on the bottom. The white, beautiful flowers there are bloodroots. And no matter what you've heard from politicians, no one goes out into a forest with a vacuum cleaner to clean up. And, leave some of this plant material up for winter. This is where things will burrow and overwinter, and just continue to complete their life cycle. Cutting some vegetation down to different lengths of 1/2 foot to 1.5 feet will allow different types of bees to overwinter in there. And then don't clean it up right away in the spring. I know we had that really nice warm weather like a week and a half ago, and I saw people already gardening and cleaning their leaves. And then we had a little bit of snow right after that. So that blanket of leaves that was covering the burrowing beetles, bees, some of the cocoons or chrysalises of butterflies, it was all removed. And then the frost came and it killed whatever was overwintering there. So I know it's hard. I know we get the urge and itch to garden, but wait for 10 consecutive days of temperatures above 50. And that should give enough time for things to sort of wake up. Another thing is, if I cut down some plants at different heights for bees last fall, in the fall of 2021, it is the summer spring, summer, and fall of 2022 that the bees that emerged somewhere else were laid their eggs in those hollow stems. And it's not until the spring of 2023 for certain bees that those will emerge. So do old stem materials in your garden for more than just one season or more than just one winter. And then when you're designing your garden, do draw a map. Is really important, even if it's like on the back of an envelope saying what you want, where you want it, how many you want. I mean, otherwise you're not going to get what you want because you will get distracted by other plants. Or maybe I'm just talking about myself, but I know drawing and writing things out really helps. And then a few words of advice, just beware of cultivars. So cultivars are native plants that have been bred for specific characteristics. So sometimes if you see these beautiful maple trees that have burgundy colored leaves, those are cultivars. And actually some research has been done that they don't benefit the same amount of insects as the other maples because of the naturally occurring chemicals in their leaves. They just are not palatable to those insects. And the jury is still out whether these plants are detrimental or helpful, or it doesn't make a difference. Probably it's going to be a species by species basis. If you want to participate in this research, Project Budburst from Chicago Botanic Gardens has a community science project that you can join and observe these plants in your home or in some of their areas. But a way to know whether a plant is a cultivar, it will have its scientific name, and then it will have another name in quotes. And that way, if it's like Penstanum digitalis for red husk, then you know it's what we call a straight species. They found a plant in nature that looked a little different, took the seeds of that plant and continued to inbreed it for those specific characteristics to come. And that is it. I will take pictures now, and I'll also go back and close the doors to my office so you can't hear my kids practicing piano. I apologize for that.
Thank you, Iza. I actually liked the little piano tinklings.